Hi, everybody. It's me, Jenny Smith, and I'm here to talk to you about cellular phone policies in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and to help you make some decisions about whether you want to ban or allow cell phones in your classroom. To get started, let's go ahead and take a look at the basic outline. First, we'll talk about the situation in present-day classrooms. Next, we'll talk about the difference between affective and cognitive learning. After that, we'll talk about the tone of your policy, how to set a tone that with your policy that students are more likely to accept. Next, we'll talk about the question of banning or not banning. What are some considerations you need to take into account when making a determination about how to manage cell phones? And then we'll talk about how to build a policy. We'll talk about including penalties, exceptions, that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, almost exactly 100 years ago, my grandmother was a brand new school teacher in a one-room log schoolhouse just a mile from the farm where I live now. The building wasn't in as good a shape as you see it here. It's since been covered with siding and is now being used by the Ruritan Club as a community building. Back then, the walls were so poor that students would actually bring their dogs, leave them outside the building, and then feed them through gaps between the logs. Students in the area were very poor. My grandmother was a young teacher bringing new skills and new ideas. In fact, my grandmother caused a near riot in the community when she asked parents to start sending their students to school with something new, a notebook. Now, at the time, all students were using slates. Notebooks were new technology in Stafford County. They were expensive and not reusable, and parents were poor. Parents couldn't see the value in buying expensive notebooks. After all, they had used slates and turned out just fine. But notebooks allowed students to do a greater volume of work and to keep their work for review. The community knew there were benefits to using notebooks, but since they were raised using slates, they were unsure how to actually use the new tool or if this was just another gimmick that would soon pass. Today, we'd never think of a notebook as being innovative or new, or to be resisted. However, 100 years ago, they were. Now, I tell this story to make the point that teachers need to view the problem of new classroom technology through a historical lens. Unstructured personal technology use is not the first classroom distraction, nor will it be the last classroom distraction. You and I are living in a time of transition, just like in my great-grandmother's day. We know there are benefits to using cell phones in the classroom, but we're unsure how to manage them. We're in the awkward stage where we're trying to teach with a tool we didn't grow up with. It's not easy. But my research over the past few months makes me believe that cell phones can be successfully managed in a classroom with a little training. Management may include a permanent or a temporary cell phone ban. It may mean that teachers need to develop some new skills so they can incorporate cell phones so seamlessly that they're a part of the classroom in the same way a desk or a notebook or a pencil is. But before we talk about how cell phones could be integrated in today's classrooms, let's take a few minutes to discuss the current classroom situation relating to cell phones. Follow along as I read these two examples aloud and see if these experiences seem familiar to you. The first comes from a Professor Duns, who is an assistant professor of theology at Marquette University. Listen to his words as he describes a situation in his classroom. Things reached a breaking point last November. I was leading a classroom discussion on the theological dimensions of Martin Luther King Jr.'s works. Much of the class listened with rapt attention. Many nodded. One noted that today's social media works to fan outrage and anger, but does not often offer constructive solutions. And for a moment, I felt they saw why a course in theology is essential to their education. My excitement was shattered when I turned and saw one student on his laptop looking at shoes for sale online, and another, head turned down, texting frantically on his cell phone. I could have kept my focus on those who were showing enthusiasm, but I surrendered control to two students who quite probably had no sense of the impact they were having. Without singling them out directly, I stopped and made a snarky comment about how some people risk their lives for civil rights and others think shopping and texting are more important. They both registered that I was addressing them and turned away from their devices. It was a Pyrrhic victory, though, because I could sense that I had lost them for the rest of the term. Teachers in the seminary group of seminary teachers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Facebook group expressed similar frustrations. On July 2nd, 2019, Catherine P. posted, "I said no cell phones, but they kept sneaking them. One girl in particular refused to put it away and openly defied me when I asked. Another girl cried because she was worried she'd miss an emergency from home. I hated allowing cell phones in the class, but the struggle was so intense that when I tried to fight the kids on it, the spirit was thin during class. Is there anyone out there who has successfully conquered this issue? I failed miserably last year, and this year I want to succeed." Does this sound familiar? The situation is dire. Consider the following information into research on college-aged kids. Now, these studies talk about college students, but note that many of these respondents were the same age as the youth you're teaching just a year or so ago. During a 2015 study of 400 college students, respondents reported that they used their phone at least once per class and that students generally believe this to be an acceptable practice. During a 2019 study of medical students in India, 12% said they wanted to use mobile phones in the class, even if it affected their learning in class. 53% of those same medical students reported that they used their cellular phone during class 21 to 30 times each day, and 12% actually reported more frequent use during class. 22% of those medical students claimed their need to use mobile phones outweighed the importance of learning. Researchers concluded, quote, "Students consider it as their right to use these devices, and they believe that this right outweighs the distraction caused in learning." Another large U.S. study showed that a majority of students believe that cellular phone use is always appropriate in the classroom. But in the same study, researchers found that 90% of instructors felt that cellular phone use was never appropriate. Well, are you freaked out? I am. Students and instructors disagree on some fundamental issues related to cell phones and their place in the classroom. Trying to enforce a cell phone policy can leave teachers exhausted and frustrated like Catherine P., or lead them to lash out like Professor Duns and lose students for the rest of the term. I think our natural reaction is to eliminate the problem, to ban phones outright, and that's a reasonable response. You're tired of feeling like the Hulk and decide that it's easier to go banner. Whoa. See what I did there? Banner, right? Okay. So it's a little cheesy, but you get the idea. It takes strength to allow phones in the classroom, and when students break rules, it can leave us feeling angry. We imagine we will feel more successful if we can ban and find peace again when we don't have to worry about cell phones. And you probably will. Banner seems like the safe bet. Hulking it or allowing phones seems dangerous. And it is. The decision whether or not to go Hulk or banner is especially difficult at church. A math teacher may ban phones with little effect on learning. In fact, it may actually help students to learn how to find math solutions on paper. But we know our gospel students need to learn the Gospel Library app in order to prepare for a mission and beyond. The church is putting more and more materials out digitally. In fact, many, like the newly reworked General Handbook, will never be put on physical media at all. Cell phones as a tool for sharing and learning the gospel aren't going away anytime soon. They just aren't. So how can a teacher resolve these conflicts? Here, a gospel teacher actually has some advantages over a secular teacher because of the learning domain we emphasize in the gospel classroom. I'm talking about affective versus cognitive learning here. Since 1956, educators have identified 3 types of educational activities called learning domains. The 3 domains are cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Psychomotor deals with manual or physical skills like using a pencil to write or jumping rope. This isn't a domain that we emphasize in the gospel classroom, so I'm not going to discuss it here. The domains we're primarily concerned about with are cognitive and affective domains. Cognitive learning is the kind with which you are most familiar. It deals with the acquisition of knowledge and development of mental skills. Think about facts, lists, formulas. The goal is often to pass a final exam where the student shows mastery of these intellectual skills. Affective learning is the type primarily concerned with the growth of feelings and emotions. The goals of affective teaching are usually to help a student develop right attitudes and pro-social values. In a secular classroom, the emphasis is mostly on cognitive learning. Secular teachers are trying to fill a student's head with lists or formulas that will give them the right information to pass a test. Teachers may work on affective learning within a class, but it's not the primary emphasis of secular education. In a gospel classroom, however, our goals are quite different. We're not trying to fill brains with lists of data. We aren't memorizing the birth dates of the apostles or performing math problems using the Nephite system of weights and measures. We are focused on helping students recognize that spirit which leadeth to do good and follow its promptings. The gospel teacher's prime focus is on affective learning, or learning that deals with feelings and behaviors, not facts. In other words, we don't want to make little churchy robots who can regurgitate information or quote the entire Bible word for word. We want to grow adults who can live happily with themselves and others, confident before God. We know that our youth will grow up in a world that sometimes does not have easy answers, that sometimes the formulas just won't work. We want to create individuals who can go through these difficult times triumphantly. We don't want to create people who talk about the world. We want to nurture people who can change it. So shifting back to our main topic, cell phones. Most of the negative reports you hear about cell phones in the classroom are based on research performed in secular classrooms and relate to cognitive learning outcomes, especially as relates to distraction. It's clear from almost a decade of research that the presence of cell phones affects cognitive learning outcomes negatively. This may surprise you, but cellular phone policies have been shown to positively affect affective learning outcomes, which are exactly the kind of outcomes that we're seeking in the gospel classroom. So I'd like you to shift gears again, and let's think back to your study of the 10 Commandments. Do you remember that some of the commandments begin with thou shalt and others with thou shalt not? They're basically do's and do nots. Well, it turns out that research shows the way that you phrase your cellular phone policy matters. The tone of a policy influences student affective learning, or the type of learning that deals with feelings and values. So when setting a cell phone policy, we have a choice whether to create a policy that's encouraging, a thou shalt policy, or a policy that's negative, a thou shalt not policy. A thou shalt policy might say something like, bring your cell phones to class to be used for class-related activities. Compare it to this thou shalt not policy that performs the same function, but with a different tone. Students may not use cell phones for any purpose outside of class. So I'm a design major, so I always like to have images to accompany concepts when I can. Let's look at a couple of images that might be thou shalts or thou shalt nots. We take a look at this picture. The individuals in the image are raising their hands. Yes, they love it. Moses' head is tilted down in sort of a friendly fashion as he shows the tablets containing the 10 Commandments to the group. But contrasted with this image, where Moses is raising the tablets up in the air, he's angry. The people are cowering away from him. Even the children are frightened. And there's little lines spraying out from Moses' head showing how cranky he is with everybody. Here's another image that has a tonal effect. This is my boy Charlton Heston in one of the movies I love the most. This is the 10 Commandments. You can see he's definitely in a thou shalt not type pose. Compare it with this painting of Moses, who has the 10 Commandments with him, and yet he's definitely here in a thou shalt pose. Tone matters in art, and it also matters in how you frame your cell phone policy. Now, this shouldn't surprise you, but students prefer encouraging policies, the thou shalt kind of policy. However, as long as the policy is perceived as fair and reasonable, a thou shalt not policy can also be accepted. It's all about student perception of your intent and tone. Here's what the research shows. Policies that encourage, here, let me shift over to my other view so you can see the slide. Policies that encourage technology use for educational purposes were associated with positive perceptions of the instructor's credibility, and a mixed technology policy, which discouraged non-academic technology while allowing technology to be used for academic purposes, did not significantly impair instructor ratings. So what's the translation? Policies that encouraged cell phone policies for on-task purposes made students think more highly of instructors. Other technology policies that discouraged off-task use but allowed on-task use did not damage instructor ratings. Note here that the thou shalt not policy didn't increase instructor ratings, but it didn't damage them either. So what do we learn? Policies that include an allowance for on-task cellular phone use are preferred by students, even if the tone of the policy is made in thou shalt not language. Another study showed that instructors who included encouraging policies in their syllabi would be perceived as more caring than instructors who included discouraging policies. And instructors who included encouraging policies would be perceived as more trustworthy than instructors who included discouraging policies. And specifically, encouraging policies appear to result in greater perceptions of instructor caring, competence, and trustworthiness than discouraging policies. So from this, what are we learning? If you want your students to perceive you as caring, competent, or trustworthy, and to report that you have a good rapport with them, your cell phone policy should be encouraging in tone. This does not mean that you have to allow unregulated cell phone use, but all of this research taken together indicates that teachers who use policies that are encouraging have better rapport with students. These two recommended policy types are positive permissive, which means they have a positive tone and permit use, or positive restrictive. This has a positive tone and restricts use. Now look, you may not be a touchy-feely kind of person. You may be thinking, look, I'm my teacher's student, not their friend. I myself have said, look, I don't need the approval of a 15-year-old. Somebody has to be the heavy, and I'll do it. Well, that's one way of approaching things, but research shows that instructor-student rapport affects the measures that are most important to gospel teachers, and we need to pay extra close attention to how we are perceived by students. Here's the first point. The link between instructor rapport and student enrollment and attendance in on and offline classes is well established. Adapting this information to the gospel classroom, the way students feel about you as a teacher affects whether they come to class and whether they'll take similar classes. This may include future enrollment in institute or other courses. The work of Frisbee and Martin has shown that instructor rapport has the greatest effect on affective learning in the classroom. They tested the relationship between instructor-student and student-student rapport in the classroom and found instructor rapport consistently predicted participation, affective learning, and cognitive learning. This important research shows that student perception of teacher rapport influences affective learning and classroom participation in classrooms more than student-to-student rapport. In other words, it's more important that students have good feelings toward their teachers than other students in order to experience positive affective learning, like positive changes in their motivation, feelings, attitudes, and values and conscience development. So here. It also means that if students have good feelings toward their instructors, they consistently participate more. So if you're frustrated with the lack of participation in your classrooms, focus on building rapport with your students. Developing an encouraging cell phone policy is one small but proven way to build rapport. Now, you'll make two choices when making a cell phone policy. We've discussed how to decide what type of tone you'll use, encouraging or discouraging, thou shalt or thou shalt not. And based on the research, I recommend that you choose an encouraging permissive or encouraging restrictive policy. There's a second consideration, whether to ban or not to ban. Gospel instructors need to weigh the benefits of cellular phones against the negatives and make a decision about whether to ban in their specific circumstance. Here's a list of questions you should consider. How will my policy affect students? How will my policy affect me? Will you feel better about yourself as a teacher by enforcing or creating this policy? How will my policy limit my teaching options? Will my policy limit student learning options? Will my policy solve the problem? What's a realistic expectation from your policy? Now, you should probably know that I do not recommend outright bans because of their effect on rapport and effective learning, and because banning is the only method that guarantees students will never learn or see proper use. So let me say that again for y'all in the back. A cell phone ban is the only method that can never teach or model proper use of cellular phones. For me, the importance of establishing rapport and credibility with students, coupled with the importance of teaching and modeling the use of the Gospel Library app, outweighs the frustration I feel when students are distracted by something outside of class through a phone. It's hard. Sometimes I lose it and I go Hulk. But the advantages of using cell phones as a tool in the classroom is worth the risk for me. Now, you may make a different decision, but please consider the following if you decide to ban cell phones. You should have an excellent reason why eliminating phones outweighs the benefits of including them, which are numerous, like losing access to all the Gospel Library tools, never being able to use an app like Kahoot or Quizzes to increase engagement, failing to teach future missionaries digital scripture skills, and losing the chance to model and encourage proper use of the cell phone. Now, there are some situations that might require a ban. You might have someone in your class that has a health condition where blinking phones might cause a problem. Or there might be an economic or wealth disparity issue so vast that you can't allow devices. You may also teach in a way that precludes the use of cell phones. For example, your lessons are exclusively instructor lecture. This is a rare situation and may only happen at the institute level, but I'm including it here and I'll discuss an outright ban in a little bit more detail later. There may be other situations that demand a ban that I can't imagine. You know your situation best. But let's talk about some reasons for banning that aren't actually very good. Number one, you're afraid students will use cell phones for purposes outside of class. Well, yes, they will. I regret to tell you this, but students will also use pencils, paper scriptures, anything they can get their hands on for purposes outside of class. But we don't ban those tools. Fearing possible misuse isn't enough reason to ban, at least not by itself. Another not very good reason is that you feel students can't handle the distraction. Remember that in gospel classrooms, our outcomes are based in affective outcomes, not cognitive outcomes. Distraction by cell phone has been shown to affect cognitive learning outcomes negatively over and over again. However, unlike secular teachers, gospel teachers aren't focused on cognitive learning outcomes. Gospel teachers focus on measures that influence affective learning. Research shows having a cell phone policy that is perceived by students as unduly restrictive or negative will negatively influence affective learning. Consider this information very carefully before you ban simply because of distraction. Another not very good reason is that you're unfamiliar or intimidated with the tools. Listen, Don't let this get you down. I promise you can learn to be a gospel library ninja. I'll help. Another reason that's not very great is that a student or two is defiant and would not comply with your more permissive policy, so you banned. Punishing a group for the infractions of one isn't best practice. Some might even argue it goes against the principle taught in the Articles of Faith, in Article of Faith 2, that men will be punished for their own sins, not for someone else's. Yes, banning phones might stop an offender, but it may also damage your rapport with all of the other students who use their agency to comply. Think hard about eliminating phones because of the sins of one or two. Now, if you decide to allow cell phones, there are some considerations for you too. Be aware that students will not always comply with your policies. Sometimes students will break the rules. Remind yourself to Q-tip, quit taking it personally, and try to remove yourself from the equation when you need to offer correction. You may sometimes need to enforce a policy, and it may not be fun. Interrupting class to correct a student who is using a phone improperly can cause you to lose track of where you were in the lesson, or make someone else lose concentration. The disruption you cause by enforcing a rule may actually be more disruptive than the actual infraction itself. If you go Hulk while enforcing your policy, you could damage your relationship with the offender and other students irreparably, like Professor Dunn's. And let's admit it, when you get frustrated, the spirit often leaves, which leaves empty lessons. This is not our desired result. You may need to sacrifice some control over the class or conquer some natural tendencies in order to allow cell phones in class. It won't always be sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns. To allow phones, it is my opinion that you really need to be an expert in the Gospel Library app, or you at least need to be willing to learn. If you simply are not willing to learn a new tool, allowing cell phones may not be for you. Don't just allow phones because enforcing a ban is too hard. Allowing phones does not absolve you of responsibility. You will still need to demonstrate and encourage proper use, and you need to be able to enforce the penalties you assign to misuse. If your policy is flawed, change it, but you must take responsibility for your policy and enforce it. Allowing cell phones will not automatically or instantly improve rapport. There are lots of things that go into developing rapport, so please don't assume that allowing phones will instantly make you the cool kid. There's lots of work every day to developing and maintaining rapport with students. Cell phone policies are just one of many ways to do so. So, whatever you decide, to ban or not to ban, be sure that you explain your policy and the reasons for it to the class, but also explain that you recognize there may be a reason for a personal, long-term, or temporary exception, and encourage students to come to you and talk about it. Students may need a short-term exception because they're waiting for a call that mom's having a baby, or they may be waiting to hear special news like a mission call, or they may need a longer-term exception due to a special learning need. I had a student once who actually got a text during class from a friend who was feeling suicidal. Of course, that's the time to stop everything and encourage your friend. Seminary can wait. Encourage students to come and talk to you if they need an exception, and ensure them you'll accommodate them. The purpose of your policy is to help students, and if it's actually hurting them, you will work to fix it. Whether you ban or not, the exception is the rule. Now, one final note here. Sometimes you don't get to decide a policy, and sometimes you might not agree with it. Please don't blame the stake seminary supervisor or bishop for a lame policy. Be sure the way you talk about leadership does not damage your credibility by making you seem like a helpless stooge, or damage other leaders' credibility by making them sound irrationally strict and out of touch. Put another way, please don't throw anybody under the bus. Deciding whether or not to ban is a difficult personal decision that depends on many factors. You can make a good decision that helps students and yourself learn and study the gospel better. Now that we've talked about our tone in our policies and thought really hard about how it will affect us and our students to ban or allow phones, let's shift gears and focus on how to actually build a cell phone policy. Now, you already know that it's best to have either an encouraging permissive or encouraging restrictive policy. But what else should a policy include? Where do you even start? Well, first, you should talk to your co-teacher. It's possible that you have very different ideas on cell phones and how to use them during class. Work together to understand each other's abilities and limitations and find ways to be unified no matter what your policy. You'll have to correct students sometimes. Demonstrate unity and support of each other when correction is necessary. Don't be that guy who is allowing students to get away with stuff while the other teacher has to be the bad guy. Discuss how, if, and when to correct infractions when the other is teaching. Consider that correcting a student during class may be far more disruptive to the flow of the lesson and feelings of students or teachers than the actual cell phone misuse itself. What kind of infractions cause a full stop to a lesson? What kind of infractions can wait until after class? When might you need to involve a parent? Try and talk this out beforehand with your co-teacher so you can be unified when problems arise. Another thing you can do is include students in policy development or introduce the policy in a way that students perceive as fair or reasonable. In a 2012 study, instructors indicated a preference for a university-wide policy much more frequently than students who support the idea of a democratically determined policy. A policy determined by the instructor, included on the course syllabus, and discussed in class was favored by the majority of students and instructors. Now, many leaders use class discussion to determine class rules. Some even make a behavior contract with the class as coursework begins. But notice that the policy most favored by both students and instructors was one determined in advance by the instructor, included on the course syllabus, and then discussed in class. So what would you discuss during this type of rules-forming discussion? Well, you might provide an explanation of when use is or isn't allowed and why. You could talk about penalties, rewards for good behavior, exceptions, that kind of thing. Your cell phone policy should also include penalties or a description of enforcement methods. Your penalties should be temporary, appropriate, and effective. These taken together mean that your enforcement method should not be permanent. Forgiveness, am I right? And it should be appropriate to the course and degree of infraction. A single text or phone ring should not trigger a level 7 nuclear meltdown from the teacher. If the infraction is minor, the penalty and enforcement should be as well. This said, your penalties should be effective. Research shows that instructors are often perceiving certain penalties to be effective that students say are not. I'll talk about specifically which types of penalties and interventions students perceive as most effective in the next video. But for right now, let's focus on this point, quote, "If the penalty for violating the policy is too mild, it will be a poor deterrent. If the penalty is too harsh, it may be unfair or even unjust to students." Now, I think penalties is a very good place to involve students in creating a policy. They can work with you to define penalties for infractions that they perceive as fair and effective. Will students leave class for a moment, surrender their phone for the remainder of class, need a parent to come free their phone after X number of infractions, sit on a naughty spot? Let students work with you to find creative and appropriate penalties. Based on my research and experience with cell phones in my classrooms, I've been teaching the gospel of cell phones for 8 years now. I have 2 recommendations I can make to teachers for establishing penalties. I recommend that you penalize individuals for noncompliance, not the entire group. I also recommend that you never make a blanket restriction due to the misbehavior of a few. Focus instead on those who comply. Now, your policy may also include rewards for good behaviors or positive reinforcements. Rarely do teachers include positive reinforcement in their cell phone policy, but I've read several essays where teachers report having success with positive methods. They also report they feel better about themselves when using positive reinforcement, and it makes sense. Who among us would rather scold someone than present an award? Well, none, I hope. So look for ways to include rewards for good behavior. Some add in free cell time to their classes. Others actually increase grade points by a percentage point after X number of days without a problem. I can imagine seminary teachers knocking off a tardy or an absence when cell phone rules are obeyed, or holding a special breakfast with a loved leader. Be creative and look for ways to encourage good behavior, not just penalize bad behavior. This is like the blessings and cursings kind of thing in the Old Testament a little bit. Am I right? Thinking back on that. Another tip that I'd like to leave you with is always include exceptions. Now, I talked about this earlier, but you should know this point is straight from me. I don't actually know of any research that covers the importance of allowing an exception to your policy. However, when I discuss the topic of cell phone policies, the issue of teachers who irrationally enforce a policy to the letter, no matter what, always comes up. And those who are more reasonable are set up as good contrasting examples to these letter of the law teachers. For example, my son, who is a student at Utah State University, told me that one of his professors bans all devices, including laptops, from his classes. Students may not even use a laptop to take notes. They are expected to use a notebook. My son explained that at first students were angry, but on the first day of class the professor explained his reasons for this ban. In this case, his lecture relied almost exclusively on discussion, and he had found that the digital note-taking impeded this process. But the professor also told students that he really wanted them to learn the best way that they could, and he told them he was willing to work with students on an individual basis for exceptions to the policy. So if someone has a special need, exceptions could be made. Oh my gosh, this is so reasonable, right? Well, my son says the policy worked, and his classes were full of great discussion, and all the students really respect this teacher, even though he had a total technology ban. This is a good example of a positive, restrictive cell phone policy. So again, this isn't research-backed. You're hearing it from me anecdotally. But I think you should always include room for exceptions in your policy, whether you go banner or Hulk. Again, your policy should be primarily a thou shalt policy, an encouraging one. But if you go with a thou shalt not policy, research shows that your policy should be one that allows for use in the classroom, or at least allow for exceptions, as in the case of the full ban. To reiterate, these two recommended policy types are positive permissive, which permits phones and has a positive tone, or positive restrictive, which restricts phones but has a positive tone. All right, to summarize, we talked about the fact that resistance and apprehensions about new classroom technologies have always been a problem. Like slates versus notebooks, cell phones aren't the first classroom problem, and they will not be the last. Though instructors and students have different feelings about phones, policies can be created that preserve instructor-student rapport. We learned about affective and cognitive learning. We learned that the goal of a gospel instructor is primarily in the affective domain, not the cognitive one, and that causes us to approach cell phones differently than a secular teacher. We talked about the importance of using an encouraging tone in developing policies and learned that research shows that cell phone policies can either be permissive or restrictive as long as our tone remains encouraging. We talked about questions you can consider when deciding whether or not to ban cell phones, and we discussed information that can help you develop a policy for your own class. Okay, so this is the end of the first training session. Hopefully you have a hoobidle of questions, a grundle even. Yay! Hopefully the next videos will help you with those. I'll be covering enforcement management aspects of cellular phone policy in more depth, what you should do to help students use cell phones in the classroom. We'll talk about the dangers of making assumptions about student finger motions, the importance of mastering the Gospel Library app, how to use it during class, on the fly to teach skills and information to students, and I'll talk about methods you can use to change the way cell phones are treated in your class, including some you may not have thought of, like classroom setup. So I'll post more videos here at this link as I complete them this week. If you have questions, please post them below. Don't contact me through Facebook, please. It's really a pain, and others will benefit from seeing our discussions. I'm interested in any feedback you have, and will try to answer any questions you've got. Some of your questions may even be treated in later videos, so please ask. Don't forget that you shouldn't share this video with other people until after March 27th. Thank you.